it's a big pleasure to welcome you back to Ukrainapodden, Fabian Hoffmann. You're a PhD fellow at Oslo Nuclear Project, and you're about to deliver your PhD this year already, but we're happy that you took time to come back to Ukrainapodden.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
I think we have to start in Poland after the recent, should we call it a drone accident or a deliberate attack on Poland?
Probably incident is a good word to describe it. I mean, it was not an armed attack, right? But it definitely was escalatory behavior from Russia, which was very purposeful. I know that there is some mis- and disinformation out there where people say, oh, it could have also been Ukrainian drones or it could have been Russian drones that were wrongly guided into Poland due to electronic warfare. But if you have a basic understanding of the guidance systems of these long-range drones, as well as of how electronic warfare works and how it's affecting these guidance systems, it's impossible that this was anything but a deliberate incident that was caused by Russia to test thresholds.
So an incident, not an accident.
Yes.
Yes. And what do you think Russia read out from the response that they have gotten from the West? Kind of what does the Kremlin, what have they written in their notebook?
Yeah. I think it's less about learning from us in terms of how we react. I mean, and obviously it's also, nice to see for them how fast we can scramble our fighters and, what types of early warning systems and tracking systems and whatnot we have in place. But I don't think that was the main purpose. I think the main purpose is to send a message to the West, right? And maybe here to provide a bit of context, Russia is in a bit of a tricky position where they want to provide or they want to make it appear that they are still in a position where they can escalate this conflict in one way or another. But in reality, their means are fairly limited, especially when it comes to what they can do within Ukraine, right? So we would call this a vertical escalation, that's when the intensity of the conflict increases. I mean, how do you want to realistically increase the intensity of the conflict in Ukraine? There's, of course, still some things you can do, right? And I think, part of what we've seen also is that they started striking the European Union representation in Kiev. They've also struck a political leadership building in Ukraine, right? That's all part of the same messaging. It's providing this message that, hey, we still have means to escalate this conflict. We can, increase the intensity within Ukraine, but we can also increase the scope of it, right? Horizontal proliferation is what we call that. So we move to other theaters. So that's all part of the same narrative framing these incidents and these attacks, right? And that's so when it happens within Ukraine. I mean, this obviously is it's more of an attack than an incident. But I think that's how we should understand it, right? So it's less about them learning our behavior and more telling us, look, if you don't step back from this conflict, if you don't adapt your behavior, things can get really, really bad for you.
But is it also about conditioning us and what we are used to? This is another threshold. There's been some things that have gone into Poland before, but this is more of a deliberate provocation. But if this happens a few times, then we're conditioned to be sort of used to that, and then they could push another threshold without very harsh ramifications.
I would actually say I don't think they're interested in us getting used to it. I think it's in their favor if we are shocked over and over again, right? Because they want to create this psychological effect where we really believe, right? And that's what Moscow is essentially betting on, is that if things heat up enough, that at one point we will step down, right? And we will let them do whatever they want and get away with a victory in Ukraine. And so us getting used to their escalatory behavior would not necessarily be in their interest, in my view, when it comes to that.
Last time you were here in February, you said that NATO had to be ready within a year or year and a half to deter Russian aggression against European NATO countries. Is that what you see now after the drone incident, or is that one step up in the escalation ladder?
I think there would still be a way up in the escalation ladder. I think basically what we've seen is an escalation, right? As I said, it's a horizontal escalation, which is a bit different from the types of vertical escalation that we've seen inside Ukraine, where the conflict intensity increases. We've seen an increase in the scope of the conflict by going directly or like doing things, incidents outside of Ukraine. And again, right, this drone attack was the latest incident, but we've seen a ramp up of the hybrid efforts over the last couple of months and years, frankly. So it's also not entirely new here. So basically, I think what you could say is that NATO and the European states, they failed to deter this escalation. I don't think we can yet say that they failed to deter an attack because, again, I would classify this as an incident. I would not classify this as an attack. I don't think we're right now at war with Russia. But clearly, Russia, on some level, they felt okay with crossing this threshold, as they have felt okay with crossing other thresholds, right, outside of Ukraine in the past. So clearly, there is some type of deterrence failure that is going on here within NATO and Europe.
And if you want to deter, you need to come with some kind of an answer that deters. How do you view NATO's response after the Polish drones or the Russian drones in Poland?
So in general, right, it's always easier to deter from the outset than to do what we call to reinstate deterrence, right? Once deterrence has failed, it's difficult to get your adversary to accept again that challenging the status quo is not worth it. And I think that's what we've seen, right? And that's also why, people like me and many others, why we emphasized in the past, in the beginning of the war and in the early months and when things started to ramp up a bit, that it's really, really important that when Russia tests small things, we have some type of reaction to deter the big things. Because once deterrence has failed, as it has now, it's probably quite difficult to get Russia to accept that, like, look, we just have to stand down and not do anything outside Ukraine anymore. So that's tricky. What was the second question?
I was just, I think you kind of answered it in nice, but if to follow up on it, how would, if you were the dictator of NATO, how would you deter Russia after this incident?
Yeah, it's really tricky, right? And a reason why I can't provide a satisfactory answer to that is because I don't know what capabilities, for gray zone action, for example, we have in Russia that we could order. I mean, one thing, of course, is I think you have to probably look at it from a denial and from a punishment perspective, right? We have to get better at denying these types of incidents in the future, and that means that we move towards, improving our defensive posture when it comes to these types of long-range drone threats. Not just now, but also because that would be really important in a broader warfighting scenario with Russia. And that's way easier said than done, right? Getting area defense for these types of long-range drone threats affordable, making it cost-effective, that's extremely difficult. But nonetheless, that's something where we have to invest. And we have, companies in Ukraine, we have companies in Europe that are working on these types of affordable point defense systems and to some extent also area defense systems for long-range drone attacks. And I think that's just something that we have to invest in. On a punishment side, I mean, clearly, or let me quickly stick with the denial side. I mean, one thing that is absolutely not okay, and what we've unfortunately have done in the aftermath, is that when a few days later Russian drones penetrated Romanian airspace, that the drones were escorted out of Romanian airspace without them being shot down. So that's not acceptable, I think. Here it's pretty clear that is a policy failure and that cannot happen. So if something penetrates our airspace, it needs to be shot down. If we then go to the punishment area, right, I think there is a good argument that we have to send some type of message back. Obviously that response would have to be very measured in what it does and what it achieves. And here, again, that's very difficult to say from the outset what that could be because we don't know what capabilities we have there.
And I guess it's also a thin line because NATO does not want a direct war with Russia, so we can't blow up under a Russian command center in Ukraine or in Western Russia, and so I guess we don't have a big toolbox to use, and the three of us doesn't know what that toolbox
exactly.
includes.
No, but it would have to be political, wouldn't it? It would have to be sanctions or something like that if you're not willing to sort of do something extra when it comes to support Ukraine or anything in that area. But how would you measure? It's probably not over yet, but how would you measure the sort of political response in NATO, especially from the US? David Frum on I don't know if it was his podcast or Tim Miller's podcast, the Bulwark, he said that he would classify that the response from NATO and from the US is basically that NATO is dead. Yeah. Is that taking it too far, or is that sort of something that Russia could read into this?
So really quickly on the point of sanctions, because I actually think that's also important. I think sanctions is quite independent of what happened with this long-range drone incident, in the sense that we have to ramp up sanctions anyways, and I think a majority of European states, they agree. But given the structures that we have, the decision-making structures, it's just not possible right now. But that would have to happen anyways, and that's totally independent of what's going on with Russian long-range drones penetrating Romanian or Polish or Baltic airspace. Sorry, what was the question?
David, from his take was that NATO is dead. If NATO is dead. Have we gone that far?
I don't know. Like, I mean, what I've been saying for, since March, when this whole Trump debacle started to go down, basically we just cannot, we should not depend on the US anymore, or we should not assume that they will be there if push comes to shove. And I think that message is just reinforced. Who knows what happens if a war broke out? Who knows if the US would, provide full support, some support, or no support? I mean, there's a lot of factors that play into this. In the end, there's a lot of career bureaucrats and military officials that I believe they would do whatever in their power to be able to fight on the side of their European allies, but you just don't know how it plays out with the leadership. So in the end, who knows what's going to happen? The only sensible thing for Europe is to believe that if a conflict breaks out, that we're alone, or without the US. If they are later in it in some way or another, that's great, but let's just not assume it from the outside.
And when the drones crossed into Poland, or NATO chose to shoot them down with quite expensive missiles. And you've written a good Substack about that. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Because the drones that Russia used, they were not the Shahed drones, they were not even the Garan drones. It was the even cheaper version that costs around $10,000.
Yeah, something like that. So those are the Gerberan drones, which are basically the Chinese imported drones, or they're largely produced in China, as far as we know. They may also have a production line in Russia. But yeah, they're really cheap. I saw figures between $10,000 and $30,000 a piece. And obviously it doesn't make sense to shoot these types of drones down with AIM-120 C7 AMRAAM missiles, which cost, $1.4 million a piece. And then also have to calculate into that an F-35 flight hour, that's 130,000 or something like that. So that's a lot, right? But that's something we knew beforehand, that shouldn't come as a surprise. I find it more surprising that some decision makers were surprised, and that then they immediately started to inquire into Ukraine about acquiring technology for intercepting these long-range drones cost effectively, more affordably. That's a huge challenge, right? That's a huge challenge for Ukraine, and obviously, frankly, Ukraine is in a lot better place of dealing with this type of long-range drone threat than we are in Europe, whether it's in Norway, Germany, or Poland, right? Or any other European country. And obviously, we have a huge capability gap that we have to address. A really important thing here is, right, and that is what makes it somewhat tricky. Basically, when it comes to missile defense, you have a trade-off between the range of the interceptor and the cost of the interceptor. So what we can do fairly effectively now or in the near future is provide very affordable point defense for these long-range drone threats, right? Really short-range, small interceptor missiles that, you know, also cost just a couple of thousand or, you know, 10, 20,000, something like that, that then are launched against that long-range drone. And then shoot it down, but like for point defense, right? In an area with a 2 to 3 kilometer radius, for example. If you want to defend a larger area, right? Like let's say 60 kilometer radius, yeah, then it's gonna get more expensive because then the size of the interceptor increases, the complexity of the missile increases, it gets harder to manufacture it, the components become more sophisticated, and then yeah, automatically the price goes up. So I think this is just something that also decision makers, they fail to realize but also fail to communicate to the broader public, is you can have affordable missile defense, but that will not cover every aspect or every part of your airspace. That's just not possible. If that's what you want to achieve, then you have to take the money in your hands and spend it.
Yeah, and one of the responses from the West has been to send more fighter jets to Poland to guard their airspace. And France is one of those countries sending, I think, 3 more Rafales jets. At least a couple of them is from, as I understand it, the French nuclear forces. I guess we should not. I guess the chances for a French jet with a nuclear bomb flying in Poland right now is quite close to zero. But if it shows that this is the reality, that they send their nuclear forces to Poland, what kind of signal is that? Just a signal without any substance, as long as they don't bring their nukes, or how should you read that?
So honestly, like, obviously we don't know how this is received in Russia. If I was a Russian nuclear strategist or decision makers, I would kind of laugh at this. Like, you know, it's okay. Like, yeah, you said 3 fighter jets that have, you know, some type of relation to the nuclear deterrent of France, but we all know that there is, you know, no nuclear weapon there. This is basically, you know, it feels extremely forced to me. Like decision makers trying desperately to come up with something that is not just more of the same, and then they pat each other on the back when they come up with this solution. Or what about, instead of just 3 Rafales, we send 3 or 3 fighter jet from this specific squadron that is attached to the nuclear deterrent, and then everyone cheers in applause, you know, and in reality nothing changes. So I think that's more of that. It is some type of signal, yes. Will it matter? No. I think there's a whole bunch of more straightforward things that would matter a lot more. For example, starting to really invest in more targeted technologies to deal with these long-range drone threats effectively.
Yeah, and you were kind of mentioning it already, but it's kind of worrying to see that after 3.5 years of full-scale war in Ukraine, and at least, I don't know for how long the Shaheds has been used now, 2-3 years? I think they started to use them already in 2022, late 2022.
Yeah, late 2022. Yeah.
So almost 3 years with the Shaheds on the radar. Europe still doesn't have a plan or capabilities to shoot them down.
Yeah, that is concerning, and you know that it's not like it had to be that way. I mean, we've seen this threat emerge for over 2.5 years now, and the response has been extremely slow. I think partially what is holding us back is that, you know, procurement initiatives in this direction, so basically you have like this situation where you have to close a capability gap on the short term, and you have a capability area or a technology sector where you don't yet have access to a mature technology for this specific purpose. And these 2 factors in combination, so capability gap, but no available system in the short term. So short-term capability gap, but no available system in the short term, at least, you know, nominally. That is something that destroys our procurement system in the West. And that's just something we are not able to handle in this peacetime mindset that we're still in. So basically what has to happen is that governments, they have to take risks, right? As I said, there are a bunch of startups and scale-ups in Europe that work in this sector. There are also some in Ukraine, and basically what you have to do now is you have to decide on the technology that you believe is most useful, whether it's electronic warfare, whether that is the interceptor drone design, whether that is a mini interceptor missile, or whether that is an anti-aircraft gun-based type tank like the Gepard or the Sky Ranger, right? But you have to bet on one technology, and then you have to make investments, right? And you have to help mature the technology, scale production, and bring it to the front line or the theater, right? And that's not what we're seeing, and that's the big policy failure.
So you basically need to move the armaments industry from the general business or industry politics of nations to security politics, and have different or a larger degree of acceptance of risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? I think that's also what I said last time I was here, that we have to increase the propensity of risk that we're willing to take, because inaction does not mean that risks decrease. That means that risks somewhere else are going to increase. So at one point you just have to take these calculated risks, whether that is dealing with Russia and how do we respond, for example, to this long-range drone threat or this incident, and do we want to move towards some type of punishment. But it also then counts for the industry, right? Like, there's no mature technology, so we have to help mature a technology so that it's in a place to deal with this threat, or help us deal with it more effectively. And that requires decision makers to make decisions and hope that later on this decision was the correct one.
Yeah. As I understand it, the drones that were sent into Poland were all the cheap drones without a warhead. As I haven't read anything about big warheads being on those drones. Should we expect a new attack within the next, let's say, half a year with more explosives on them? Is that the next step in the ladder?
It's certainly possible. I mean, the thing is, these drones, they had a reconnaissance payload, so basically an electro-optical seeker. That's a fancy word for a video camera. So it took pictures, right, and videos. By the way, another great indication that this was purposeful, right? If you have that number of drones flying into Poland, and they were not destined for Poland, there would have probably been a high chance that some of them would have carried, some type of lethal warhead. Also, the Gerbera drones, by the way, they have that sometimes, right? Even though they're primarily equipped with a reconnaissance payload, sometimes they also incorporate like a 1 to 2 kilograms warhead, which is, lethal for the person, for example, finding the drone, or can cause great injury. So another indication there. I mean, it is possible, right? So it is, if Russia believes that, they can send a message, or their signaling is helped by launching a small or medium number of armed long-range drones into NATO territory, then they might do it. Yeah. Obviously, this would be more risky for them to do as well, right? Keep in mind that Russia, they may care little about us, but they care more. So Europe, right? Because basically Russia believes that we are American puppets, anyways. We don't matter in this whole scheme. But they care about what the United States, China, and India and others think. So in that sense, it's also not straightforward they would do it. But if they believe, it serves the interest, then they might, right? So that means, okay, we have to deter this type of scenario.
I don't want to go into the conspiracy corner here, but this attack incident with Poland happened just a week after Putin's visit to China, where he met with his good friend Xi Jinping and other, less democratic world leaders. The attack on the full-scale war attack on Ukraine happened also less than a week after Putin's visit to China. Is there a chance that this was kind of discussed within the
Dictator Club
to cite an Applebaum? Or do you think this is, I think we might get into a deep water here, but there's a timing here which is at least interesting, even though we cannot really know anything?
We obviously don't know. I would honestly be more surprised than not if it was discussed between them. Obviously, could be, who knows. But what I definitely believe is true, that the growing partnership with China is providing a great confidence boost to Putin and Russia. So based on that, this is very relevant that, or it might be relevant that the visit was there a week earlier, where again, the sentiment of partnership and friendship was reinforced. So Putin thought, okay, now I can put one on top.
Yeah. So yeah, let's not dig deeper into that hole until at least we know anything more, because it's a dangerous path to start on, I guess. If we go from attacks on Poland, we can talk a little bit more about Ukraine's long-range capabilities, and especially the new Flamingo missile, which was kind of shown to the world around a month ago now, I guess. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about it here on the podcast earlier, but what's your impression of the Flamingo missile? Because it sounds quite impressive with the 1,050 kilo warhead, 3,000 kilometer range, and a mass production within this year until 7 a day, isn't it?
Yeah,
Something
7
like
a day, 200 a month, around 2,500 per year. Yeah, that would be extremely impressive. I think that is a very optimistic assessment of the manufacturer. I don't necessarily believe that's the most realistic one. We can talk about that later, why that's the case. But I think the missile system is fairly significant. Not so much only because of the Flamingo, of course, right, if the missile works, that's great. But it is a clear indication that within Ukraine's overall missile program, it's essentially taking the next step, and very much a needed one, which is to move from these lighter drones and missiles, right? These long-range drones and then these mini cruise missiles that Ukraine has been manufacturing and using, towards a heavy missile capability, right? A heavy hitter, so to say. And that's really something that has lacked in Ukraine's arsenal, and that has held behind the long-range strike campaign that Ukraine has been pursuing. The reason is very simple. I mean, if you have a long-range drone or a mini cruise missile that is equipped with a payload of 10, 20, 50, 80 kilograms, the lethality in the end, if it strikes the target, is a lot less devastating than if you have a missile like the Flamingo, which has a warhead of over 1,000 kilograms. And I think if they can really manage, right, to get that Flamingo going, it would help move this long-range strike campaign that is ongoing right now from disruption to real destruction. Because right now it's still fairly often the case that, we get fancy pictures and great pictures from Ukrainian long-range drones striking these refineries, and then you have an explosion and a fire. But in reality, these damages, they can be repaired within 1 or 2 days. And that's just because the payload, first of all, is very small that's in it. So, these long-range drones very often, sometimes only a 20 kilograms payload. That means you have maybe 10 kilograms of high explosives. That will cause a certain level of destruction in the immediate vicinity, but not a lot outside. And the other factor is that these long-range drones, they are pretty slow. And that prevents the warhead from penetrating inside the structure before it explodes, right? It's simple. Kinetic energy is speed times weight, or velocity times weight. And essentially then, if you have a really large and rather fast cruise missile like the Flamingo, you increase the destruction twofold, both because it penetrates more deeply into the structure, and then second, when it explodes, it really explodes.
Is that the reason why they've been so active in hitting fuel tanks and refineries? Because then you get a secondary explosion and a large fire, so you don't need that much of a warhead?
Pretty much, yes. So these are really soft targets. That's what we call them. And also have to keep in mind these long-range drones and also these mini cruise missiles. They are equipped only with mid-course guidance. So essentially they have an autopilot that is then updated by GPS, right? But they don't have what we call terminal guidance, which, cruise missiles or long-range drones, they would often rely on an electro-optical seeker, so a video camera or an infrared seeker. They don't have that. So basically they don't really have pinpoint accuracy. That means they will typically strike, their targets within 5 to 10 meters. If you're unlucky more, if you're lucky less. But that's, the typical distribution that we would expect from these types of drones. And that paired with the small payload, the small explosive power means, you can really only go after soft targets. Of course, Ukraine has gotten lucky in the past, right, where a couple of drone strikes, they caused secondary explosions, they caused large fires, and some refineries were out of function for weeks, if not months. But very often, as I said, it's also just these things can be repaired rather easily. Right, a fire can be extinguished, and then it's back to business. And so a Flamingo would really help here.
I saw a report about the large, massive factories that Russia has built in Siberia that produces different kinds of drones, Shahed drones, among other things. And they had been hit by one of these long-range drones from Ukraine, and you saw it damaged some of the roof of one of the factories.
Exactly.
If they were lucky, maybe they injured some personnel, but it must not have been more than an annoyance for them.
No.
But a Flamingo with such a large warhead, they could actually do some damage.
Potentially more, but I think people are overly optimistic of what you can do if you have the ability to strike these factories. As you mentioned, very often, unless you hit critical machinery inside that factory, it really does not matter. And if you look at what these Shahed factories look like from the inside, or Geran 2 factories, right? There is not a lot of fancy machinery there. There's just a bunch of workers carting around, handmade, right? Carting around unfinished airframes and components, and then put them together by hand. So, if you would want to comprehensively destroy this thing, you would need hundreds of missiles and warheads. And I think in any case, that is not sustainable. So, it's tricky, Maybe the better approach for Ukraine is not to go after the factories, but try to figure out where they store finished Geran 2 drones and try to destroy them preemptively. Obviously, right? Striking these factories may do something, but I think it will not have the effect that people hope it will have. But by the way, there was exactly the same during World War II. German factories, when they're hit by bombs, Allied bombs, very often it did not matter at all because you hit a break room or something like that. Actually, the United States, right, it's a bit of history trivia now, but the United States, they cooperated heavily with banks who financed some of these factories in peacetime to figure out how exactly these factories look like and where fancy machinery may be located in order to hit that more effectively. So that really shows, right, how difficult it is to really disrupt a running factory, especially the dispersed type of production process that Russia is running.
Yeah, and basically Germany had, until the last month or so of the war, had the same production capacity almost. Yeah, exactly.
Although also here, like the really important thing is, right, that German production capacity peaked in mid-44, I think. But always have to keep in mind, right, if it wasn't for that Allied air campaign, the peak would have been much higher. So in that sense, it had a great effect, right? It's not an absolute effect; it's a relative effect. I mean, I think if I was Ukraine, I would basically continue what I'm doing right now, and that is to go after these refineries, because in the end, what you want to do is undermine Russian state capacity, right? Prevent them from exporting oil. Cause shortages inside Russia. That's like try to kill Russian revenue, right? Warfighting revenue. That's the best or most effective strategy that I see.
Yeah, and it works quite well, it seems. Like it's not Russia is still running, but
exactly. Again, it's the same, right? It's not an absolute effect. It's a relative one. Would we rather be in a position where Ukraine is able to destroy 17% of Ukraine's refining capacity or zero? Like the answer is very easy, right? 17% is better, even if it's not 100%.
And I guess even though Russia is still running, not all cars in Luhansk are because of lack of fuel.
Yeah, but also they're running a deficit even at 100%. So if you can reduce it by 15 or 20%, it just makes the deficit larger.
Yeah, I mean the thing is, I'm not an economist, but if I look at where things stand in Russia, I don't think they're nearing the point of collapse in 2025, and 2026 may also kind of work out still for them. But Russia knows that as this war progresses and there's no progress made along the front line, things are going to get dicey for their economy from 2027 onwards. And again, right, that doesn't mean there's going to be a sudden collapse in 2027, but like all these economic issues that are piling up right now in Russia, they're going to compound. And at one point, things are going to get really uncomfortable. And it's what you said, that Russia is running quite the budget deficit at this point. And if you can increase the deficit, that will have major ripple-on effects across the board. So
yeah, and they already have a situation where they can't pay for all the stuff that they would want to have. So it already has an effect on the war, even though it's not a massive effect.
We've seen the Flamingo missiles been used once, we think, on was it the FSB outpost on Crimea?
Yeah.
I guess we can't call that attack 100% success, but it was a big boom.
Yeah, so obviously really tricky to draw big conclusions from a single attack. But yeah, so I would say the missiles that were used overall in the attack, they displayed, or they basically were able to prove minimum expectations, but likely not more than that. The reason is, 3 missiles were launched according to public records. 2 arrived at the base. 1 missed its likely aim point, and this is what makes it tricky, right? We don't know exactly what the aim point was. 1 missed the likely aim point by 10 to 40 meters, and the second one missed its aim point by 80 to 200 meters. And the third one never arrived. We don't know if it was shot down by the Russians or if it had an internal systemic failure that prevented it from reaching the target site. But in any case, it never had an impact. And if the first warhead, which missed by 10 to 40 meters, there you can say, given that I have such a large warhead in the Flamingo, I can compensate for that level of inaccuracy, especially if it's at the lower end. But the second warhead, 80 to 200 meters, that is a large miss, even for such a large warhead. So that cannot have been satisfactorily for Ukraine. So what I hope, right, and obviously then again, important to keep in mind, this is one instance of these missiles being used and only 3 being used in total. So let's not overinterpret it. But I do believe that both the manufacturer and the Ukrainian armed forces, they probably would have hoped for a lot more. Or not a lot more, but it's a bit more, right? Especially given that it was an FSB outpost in northern Crimea, meaning it was not heavily defended. So, for example, the missiles that did not have to overfly a lot of Russian air defense positions. That also means, it's somewhat more likely that this third missile failed due to an internal failure rather than being intercepted. But by and large, let's just hope that the manufacturers, they have some good data from this use, and they can use that to improve the design going forward.
How about the long Neptune missile? Do we know much about that and what that adds to Ukrainian capabilities?
Yeah, it's always honestly a bit of a mystery because the Neptune it entered into service in mid-2021. So it was the one missile system that Ukraine had up and running prior to the war starting. And it was a proven design, right? It was also used early in the war then to kill the Moskva, the big Russian cruiser in the Black Sea. So that means, the missile system, it works. And then it would make sense, right, as the war starts, that Ukraine is turning an adapted, longer-range land attack optimized version of the Neptune, which the long Neptune is, into a crash program and try to field that as soon as possible. And for some reason, that hasn't really happened. And it was only, I think, 2 weeks ago that we finally got a picture of what this long Neptune looks like. And essentially, it is an adapted Neptune, right? The rear and front section, they look entirely similar. It only has a thicker and longer midsection, likely for more fuel. So that then really begs the question, why did it take so long? And there, we can speculate. It could very well be that Russian strikes on Ukrainian missile industries have disrupted this program, and more broadly the missile industry. I think it's also plausible that as the war started and then maybe as this program stalled, that some of the engineers that have been working on it, that they moved to other startups that then have moved on to build those long-range drones and those mini cruise missiles. But clearly something has gone wrong, I would say, right? And now we have to see. I mean, the long Neptune, it would also be part of this heavy missile category. The warhead is a lot lighter, but it still has, long range and fairly high velocity, at least compared to these long range drones. So it has a high lethality potential against different targets. So it would be an important missile system to have. The question also here is, can the manufacturer actually scale up production?
Yeah, and when I met Alexander Commission in March, he used to be the Minister of the Defense Industry in Ukraine. He said they had used a long Neptune twice. And we really haven't heard much about it before a month ago when they showed us the picture. So I guess it proves that something has not gone as smooth as they hoped for. Yeah,
that happens often, that they use missiles that are not yet publicly known or not yet publicly known to have entered into mass production, that they test them essentially by launching them inside Russia, which of course makes sense if you're Ukraine. And, in that sense, it's absolutely not surprising that long Neptune has been used. What is surprising is that, it takes that long and that they are not able to, presumably build more than a handful each month, if at all.
Yeah. It was a lot of hype about the Flamingo missile when it was launched. Why do you think Ukraine chose to be so open about it?
I think it was more the manufacturer. I think it was less the Ukrainian decision-making apparatus. I think it was the manufacturer that really went on a PR campaign here. Probably because they want to sell their product. I mean, essentially, right? There are some preferred products within the MOD, which, for example, you have the long Neptune, you have the Sapsan short-range ballistic missile, and then you also have the Korshun land attack cruise missile, which is an adapted KH-55 from back in the Soviet days. And for, again, for some reason, like all these legacy programs within the MOD, they don't really seem to be taking off. At the same time, the MOD appears to still be sticking with them. And maybe, this is one hypothesis here, is that the manufacturer said, okay, this is, we're unhappy with that, and we're just going to go out ourselves and promote this product in the hope that maybe it will shake things up inside the MOD. And actually, to some extent, it worked, right? Because Zelensky then, I think a day later, came out and talked about the Flamingo, even though, maybe he hadn't heard that often about it before. And now he has. So maybe this is changing things up. And I think in any case, right, whether the Flamingo is a total flop, right, or if it's actually a missile system, I think the benefit here is that there is a new dynamic in this heavy missile sector in Ukraine. And that was urgently needed because those legacy systems, they kind of stymied and they were not moving forward. So I hope, right, that with Flamingo, either with that specific product or with another product or with another manufacturer, but like something is happening here and that this heavy missile capability is going to arrive sooner than later.
I'm afraid we have to let you go now. Do you have anything you were not able to say yet? Any last thoughts before we leave you?
No, I think it was pretty comprehensive. Let me think. No, I also don't think I have any insane predictions to make. I would say, actually having talked, let's end with that. Having talked with some colleagues and also just some interested people from the public, I'm less concerned about what happened in Poland than others, I think. And the reason is that the conflict spiral model that is often portrayed, right? That you go down this spiraling conflict and at one point it all ends in war. I don't really believe in that. And I think empirically what we've seen over the last couple of years and decades is that conflicts, they don't escalate accidentally or inadvertently. Conflicts escalate because decision makers want them to. right? And that gives me calm because I think, yeah, this was a very measured, deliberate incident caused by Russia, but they could have also caused a lot worse, right? So that maybe also is good for us to know that we still have, all the agency in the world to prevent and deter worse things to come from Russia.
Yeah, because Russia doesn't want war with NATO, and NATO doesn't want war with Russia.
I hope not, yeah. Right, that's the thing. We can't look into the heads of decision makers in Russia. Maybe they want war, right? So at the very least, what we have to do is present them with a deterrence posture so they understand that even if they want war, they will not get away with it.
Fabian Hoffmann, thank you so much for coming back to us. It was a pleasure as always, and I hope you get back another time.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great being here.
And good luck with your PhD.
Thank you.
Thank you.